Okay, we're going to start our last section of the year, and it's going to be a very short unit on a concept which we've talked about a lot all year, and something that you guys are probably all very familiar with because you've been learning about it since you were in science class. But it is a theory called evolution, and it really is um, a great explanation as to how we got to where we are today and where we could be going next, right? We don't know what the next step of evolution is for the human species, but it certainly isn't done. So let's get started, and we're going to talk a little bit about the history of this idea, and really it can be credited to one man named Charles Darwin. And you've heard of him before. He's a famous scientist, and he is known as being the person who developed this theory of evolution. And he was not alone. Just like in almost every topic we covered this year, there were many other scientists that were working at the same time as him, and there were scientists that he relied on for his information. And if this was a normal school year where we're in the classroom, we would spend some time talking about some of those other scientists and their discoveries and kind of how Charles Darwin got to a point where he was able to make his big theory, which is this theory of natural selection and evolution. But we're going to skip all that and we're going to just talk about Darwin. So, you probably have heard of him before, like I said, and he is an interesting character. He's an interesting person because like a lot of people in this time period, he was raised with religion, and religion was a big part of the society in which he lived, which was in England. The church really was the governing body, and Charles Darwin was a rich kid. He was a rich kid that grew up in a good part of England, and his dad had high expectations for him, and he was expected to go on to have a very illustrious career, either as a doctor, which was the original plan. He was going to school to be a doctor, and he realized that it wasn't for him, so he switched. And he was your typical very smart person who didn't really fit into a school setting. And as a teacher, I'm used to that. I have students like that all the time. You could tell they're brilliant, but they just don't like school, and the thing that has going to spark their intelligence and their brilliance just hasn't happened for them yet. And Darwin was like that. He was one of those kids that didn't really care that much about school, but he liked learning. And then he went on to try actually seminary school. He wanted to be a priest. I don't know that he wanted to, but that was kind of the direction he was pushed. And again, did not work out for him. And then finally, he had an opportunity. He's a young guy. He had an opportunity to go on a trip around the world. He met a sea captain who had a ship called the HMS Beagle, and they traveled around the world. And Darwin came along first off as a friend for the captain. They hit it off. They got along really well, but also as something called a naturalist. And what a naturalist is, somebody who studies nature. So he traveled around the world on the ship, and it was a 5 year voyage actually. So for 5 years he went around the world and he collected species, and he would collect species from different locations, South Africa, in parts of Asia, and he would send them back to England where they were, being collected, and he was going to study them. And then he hit this area called the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos Islands is a very unique location, and it's one of the main reasons why Darwin was able to make his discoveries is because they landed at the Galapagos. And he spent a while there, and he collected over 1,500 different species just on the Galapagos Islands. So what is a species, you may be asking? Well, a species is basically it's a group of individuals that can reproduce with each other. So the human species can only reproduce with other humans. So a species is a group of individuals or a population that can interbreed. Now, let's talk a little more about the Galapagos. Now, if you take a look down here at this image, this shows you a little bit about why the Galapagos were so special. It's actually made up of 5 islands, and those 5 islands were close enough to each other that things could travel from one to the other at certain points. But because of where it's located, there were extremely strong ocean currents and wind currents. And what that did was it made it so even though these islands were close to each other, they had very different climates on each island. One island would be dry and cooler, one island would be warmer and moister. And because of the air and the wind currents and the water currents, it was difficult to travel from one island to another. And that was a perfect scenario to develop the observations which Darwin made. And what he noticed was basically what he found was that different species could be found on these different islands. Like, for example, tortoises. He spent a lot of time looking at tortoises. He spent a lot of time looking at finches. He looked at iguanas. And what he found was on each of these islands, They looked similar, but there were some major differences between them. And what he found was those differences had something to do with where they lived, and it had something to do with what allowed them to survive. And what he called those were adaptations. So an adaptation is any trait which allows you to survive in an environment. It could be anything, right? So for example, think about the human species. What are some of our adaptations that allow us to survive? Well, I'm going to go with first and foremost our brains. Our brains are unique. As far as we know, they're not like any other brains of any other animal, and that brain is what allows us to be able to function in our world and be able to adapt. So our adaptability is an adaptation. Also, we have an opposable thumb. If you take your thumb, you can see it goes in opposite. The other four fingers all curl one direction, but your thumb goes the opposite direction. It goes side to side, and what that allows us to do is it allows us to pick things up, carry them, manipulate fine tools. So an adaptation is very simply a trait which allows you to survive and pass on your genes. Now, this is a great diagram because what this shows you is a good example of something called adaptive radiation, which is the idea that species are going to change over time based on their environment. These are all examples of finches, and a finch is a type of bird. And what he found was that each island had a different type of finch on it. Some islands had finches with big fat beaks that were shorter. Some islands had thinner, pointier beaks. And what he found was, depending on the island, islands that had more trees are going to be more inclined to have berries and seeds and things like that. So you're going to see finches that have wider, fatter beaks for cracking seeds. And other islands that, have more insects to feed on, they're going to have beaks that are more inclined to get to smaller areas, like they can get into cracks in trees and be able to get to the insects a little bit better. So what he found was that depending on the island that they were at, they had different shaped beaks, and that beak allowed them to eat specific organisms. So for example, these guys here all eat mainly insects, and you can see their beaks are shorter and a little bit longer. These guys here eat mainly seeds, and their beaks are built for cracking seeds open. They're bigger, they're fatter, they have a little more strength to them. So great example of showing how different species change based on their environment. Here's another great example. He looked at tortoises. Now, these are 3 different tortoises from 3 different islands in the Galapagos. And if you take a look at them, you could tell something about what these tortoises eat. Now, first off, you can see this would be like the average tortoise that has an average length neck, average length legs. This guy down here has got a much shorter neck with a bigger bottom legs here, and this guy here is a much longer neck. So what does that tell you? Well, what that would tell me is that this guy is built for burrowing, right? His head's protected. He can be underground. He can have his head near the ground. It's much easier for him to get to food that is near or on the ground, where this guy right here is going to be built for getting to leaves on trees. He can sit back on his hind legs, and his long neck allows him to get to some of the leaves at the higher points of the trees. So this is just another great example of how these species can adapt to their environment. Darwin really came up with a few major theories, and his first one was something called natural selection. And natural selection is the idea that the species supplies the genetic traits. So for example, we individually, humans, have the traits, and then nature determines which ones survive based on how well those organisms are fit for their environment. So it's when an individual is best suited for its environment, it can survive, mate, and pass on its genes. Now, this is an important part of that statement. It's got to be able to pass on its genes. If a species is very well, let's say, for example, me, I don't have kids, right? So let's say I'm the perfect human being. I know you're probably thinking it already, but let's say you just realize I'm the perfect human for this environment. I'm immune to coronavirus, right? I can't get coronavirus. If I don't ever have kids, that is a wasted trait because I'm not passing on that trait to my offspring. So in order for this to work, in order for natural selection to work, these species have to pass on their traits. There's actually 4 major factors that need to happen in order for natural selection. First, you need to produce more than are going to survive. So if there's not enough of a species, it's not going to survive no matter what. So you need to have more produced than can actually survive. If you look at other organisms, they usually produce at much higher numbers than humans, right? Insects, they hatch, thousands of eggs at a time. Reality, those are not all going to survive. So you need more than are going to survive to be produced. You need variation in order for in order for natural selection to work. If everything was exactly the same, that whatever kills them off is going to kill off everything. For example, let's use coronavirus. Let's say some people are immune to coronavirus, and let's say coronavirus was a more serious illness, and if you got it, it killed you, right? Let's say that was how serious it was. Anybody that was immune to the virus is going to survive and pass on their traits. Anybody that's not immune to the virus is not going to survive. So if everybody was immune, then everybody would survive. Obviously, that's a good thing. But if everybody was not immune, then everybody would die. So you need variation. There needs to be what we call a genetic variation in the gene pool. There needs to be competition in order for natural selection to work. You need to have a scenario where some species or some individuals are better suited for their environment than others, and they compete for that. If there's enough resources for everybody, everybody's going to survive. And if everybody survives, natural selection doesn't work. So I got news for you guys. Humans are kind of breaking natural selection because of our agriculture. Now, you can argue our brains give us the adaptation to have agriculture, but because of agriculture, we have way more food than you'd ever think we would have, and it allows for way more humans to survive. Because of modern medicine, it allows for way more humans to survive. So essentially what's happening is competition is being decreased. So natural selection, it still exists in the human species, but we definitely have changed things. And then finally, in order for natural selection to work, this seems kind of obvious, but for those who can't survive, they have to die. If nothing ever died, you would never have natural selection. So that's kind of an obvious idea. But in order for natural selection to work, you need species to die. Individuals have to die. Okay, and I'm going to finish up here with the last concept, which is the other side of natural selection. And the other side of natural selection is artificial selection. And artificial selection is something that humans do. We select the traits that we want. So this is what Darwin looked at to come up with this idea of natural selection. He saw we were already doing it. This diagram here shows you corn, right? So in the wild, corn exists in many different sizes. There's little thin pieces of corn, there's big fat pieces of corn. So if you're a farmer that produces corn, you want the best possible corn. So you're going to take the corn from the best possible pieces and you're going to use that to reproduce. And over time, you're going to keep getting bigger and bigger pieces of corn. If you've never seen a wild strawberry, you probably be very surprised to see how small they are. When you go to the grocery store and buy a strawberry, they're big, they're juicy, they're red. But if you go out into nature and you just start picking strawberries, first of all, they're not that sweet. They're not as sweet as they are at the grocery store, and they're much smaller. So humans have taken the traits that they like and they bred them with each other. Perfect example is this image right here. This is a whole bunch of dogs. Now, here's the thing about dogs that you knew already, I'm sure, but when you see it here, it makes it very apparent. Dogs are weird, and dogs all came from this guy right here. This is a wolf. And all of these guys here, from this little tiny, who knows what that is, and this thing here, which is some kind of, Shih Tzu or something. I don't even know what they're called. They're all wolves, to be honest with you. They can all mate with each other, which is weird, and they can all mate with a wolf. So we've taken the traits that we've wanted, and we've bred them to be dogs. So what natural selection is nature just does it instead of us. That's a good stopping point for this lesson. Thank you very much.